Evelyn, with all due respect, the protocol has been updated since you last certified on this. Let's just stick to the new guidelines. The voice belonged to Dr. Ben Carter, and it was saturated with the kind of polite, dismissive patience one uses for a cherished but fundamentally outdated piece of furniture. He smiled, a flash of white teeth under the harsh fluorescent lights of the emergency room, but the smile didn't reach his eyes. His eyes were fixed on the tablet in his hand, the glowing screen that held all the modern data-driven answers he would ever need. Evelyn Reed said nothing. She simply looked at the patient on the gurney, a young man who'd taken a nasty fall from a ladder, his breathing shallow and stertorous. Her gaze was calm, analytical, taking in the subtle cyanosis around his lips, the paradoxical movement of his chest. Her hands, gnarled with the first whispers of arthritis after 45 years of nursing, remained clasped loosely in front of her. They were perfectly still. She had suggested a simple jaw thrust maneuver, a basic hands-on technique to open the airway while they prepped for intubation. It was old school, something you learned by feel, not by algorithm. Dr. Carter, however, was already calling for the video laryngoscope, a top-of-the-line device that would give him a perfect digital picture of the man's vocal cords. It was the gold standard, the textbook answer. It was also slower. Evelyn held her tongue. It was her last day. After nearly half a century walking these linoleum floors, she was done fighting these small, quiet battles. She had seen generations of hotshot young doctors come and go, each one armed with newer theories and shinier equipment, each one certain they were reinventing a wheel she'd been rolling along for decades. Ben Carter was one of an endless line. He was brilliant, she didn't deny that. He had a mind like a steel trap and hands as steady as a surgeon's. But he saw patients as complex puzzles to be solved, not as people to be healed. He trusted his data more than his instincts, and he trusted his credentials more than the quiet wisdom of a woman who had been stopping bleeding and calming terrified hearts since before he was born. She watched as his team fumbled with the equipment for a precious 30 seconds. The patient's oxygen saturation dipped into the high 80s. Finally, with the camera in place, Carter expertly slid the tube home. The numbers on the monitor began to climb back to green. He had succeeded, and he shot Evelyn a look that was meant to be inclusive, a little, "See, we got it" glance. She just gave him a small, tired nod and moved away to fetch a warm blanket. She knew her method would have had the man breathing easier a full minute sooner. A minute didn't matter this time, but sometimes a minute is everything. The rest of her shift passed in a blur of familiar routines. She changed dressings, documented charts with her neat practiced cursive, and showed a new nursing graduate how to start an IV on a dehydrated elderly patient without blowing the vein. She moved with an economy of motion that was almost unnerving in a woman of her age. Her back was ramrod straight, a lifetime of ingrained discipline that had nothing to do with nursing school posture. At 4 o'clock, the staff surprised her with a sheet cake in the break room. The frosting was saccharine sweet, and the coffee was lukewarm. Dr. Carter made a short, eloquent speech about her years of dedicated service, calling her an institution and the heart of the hospital. He meant it in his own way. He respected her history, even if he didn't respect her experience. Evelyn smiled, accepted the hugs and the flimsy card filled with signatures, and felt a profound sense of dislocation. They were saying goodbye to a sweet old nurse, a hospital fixture. They had no idea who they were really letting walk out the door. She drove home to her small, tidy house at the edge of town, the one with the sprawling garden she now had all the time in the world to tend. She changed out of her scrubs for the last time, slipping into a soft cardigan and comfortable slacks. The quiet of the house settled around her, a silence that felt both liberating and heavy. For the first time in 45 years, no one was about to crash or bleed or die on her watch. The thought was a relief. It was also terrifying. The news broke just after sunset. A passenger train, winding its way through the treacherous Black Rock Pass 20 miles north of town, had derailed. The early reports were chaotic, a mess of frantic cell phone calls and garbled radio transmissions, a bridge washout, multiple cars tumbling into a ravine. The terrain was remote, accessible only by a single winding service road that was now likely blocked by mudslides from the same storm that took out the bridge. The hospital she had just left, the only level 3 trauma center within 100 miles, was about to be inundated. Evelyn watched the news on her small kitchen television, a knot tightening in her stomach. She could picture the scene at the ER perfectly, the controlled chaos tipping into outright panic, the limited resources stretched to their breaking point, the cacophony of phones ringing and monitors beeping and people screaming. She saw Dr. Carter, his brilliant mind racing, trying to apply neat, orderly protocols to a situation that was anything but. He would be good. He would be professional. But he would be overwhelmed. The book he relied on so heavily didn't have a chapter for this. She felt a phantom ache in her hands, a reflexive urge to be there, to be doing something, anything. She forced it down. It wasn't her problem anymore. She had earned her peace. She had earned her silence. At the hospital, it was worse than she could have imagined. Dr. Carter stood in the center of the ER, a lone island in a sea of red and white. The first wave of victims had arrived, brought down from the pass by a handful of heroic volunteer firefighters in pickup trucks. The injuries were horrific: crush trauma, complex fractures, severe hemorrhaging. The air was thick with the coppery smell of blood and the sharp scent of antiseptic. Carter was a machine, moving from patient to patient, calling out orders, his voice strained but clear. "Get me a chest tube in Bay 3. I need 2 units of ONEG in Bay 5 now. Where's the portable ultrasound?" He was performing flawlessly, a testament to his training. But he was losing the war. For every patient he stabilized, 3 more were brought in. He was trying to save everyone, treating each case with the full weight of his considerable skill. And in doing so, he was failing at the most critical task in a mass casualty event: triage. He was spending 15 minutes on a complex pelvic fracture that required a specialist surgeon he didn't have, while a patient with a tension pneumothorax, a condition that could be fixed in 60 seconds with a needle, was dying in the hallway. His adherence to providing the best possible care for the individual in front of him was becoming a fatal liability for the group. He knew it, somewhere deep down, but he couldn't bring himself to make the cold, brutal calculations required. He couldn't decide who was worth saving and who had to be left to die. That's when the sound began. It was a low, guttural whump, whump, whump that started as a vibration in the floor and grew until it rattled the windows in their frames. It was a sound utterly alien to this small, quiet town. Every head that could lift, lifted. Nurses and orderlies rushed to the windows. In the ambulance bay, bathed in the flashing red and blue lights, 2 enormous matte black helicopters were descending. They weren't medical life flights. They were angular, predatory, and bore the markings of the U.S. Air Force, UH-60 Black Hawks. They touched down in the employee parking lot with a final deafening roar, their rotor wash sending trash cans and loose gravel skittering across the asphalt. Hospital security guards ran out, waving their arms uselessly, their authority a complete joke in the face of such overwhelming presence. The side door of the lead helicopter slid open, and a figure jumped out before the skids were even fully settled. He was a man in his late 50s, wearing a dusty green flight suit, his face a mask of grim determination. He moved with a purpose that parted the sea of chaos in the ER. He wasn't running, but he was covering ground with an unnerving speed. He bypassed the frantic charge nurse, ignored a security guard who tried to stop him, and strode directly toward the triage center where Dr. Carter was desperately trying to intubate a patient with massive facial trauma. The man in the flight suit didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. The sheer force of his presence cut through the noise. "Who's in charge here?" Dr. Carter didn't look up from his patient. "I am, and unless you're a thoracic surgeon, you're in my way." The man didn't flinch. He scanned the room, his eyes missing nothing, his gaze lingering for a fraction of a second on the overflowing hallways, the impossible number of critically injured patients. "I'm Colonel Matthews," he said, his voice flat and hard. "We're here to assist with extraction, but first, I need someone. I need Evelyn Reed." Carter finally looked up, his frustration boiling over into disbelief. "Who? Evelyn? She's a retired nurse. She went home hours ago. This is her last day. What in God's name could you possibly want with her?" Colonel Matthews leaned in, his voice dropping to a low, intense register that was more menacing than any shout. "Doctor, you have a catastrophic failure of triage protocol. You're losing people you could be saving because you don't know who to save first. I don't want Evelyn Reed. I need her. She is the protocol. Now, get me her address. You have 10 seconds before I have my PJs pull it from your hospital's servers. We are wasting time." The authority radiating from the man was absolute. It was the authority of someone who had seen worse than this and had lived. Ben Carter, for the first time in his professional life, was utterly speechless. He stared at the colonel, then at the carnage around him, the failure he was presiding over. He numbly relayed Evelyn's address to a waiting nurse. The sound of the Black Hawk approaching her house was unmistakable. Evelyn was in her garden, pulling weeds under the soft glow of a porch light, her mind a million miles away, when the rhythmic thumping began. It grew louder, closer, until the very air around her seemed to vibrate. She stood up, her back aching slightly, and looked to the sky. The dark shape descended not on the road, but into the empty pasture behind her property, its landing lights cutting terrifyingly bright swaths through the twilight. She felt a cold dread wash over her, a feeling she hadn't experienced in 30 years. This wasn't a local emergency. This was something else entirely. This was a ghost from a past she had meticulously buried. The rotor wash flattened the tall grass as the helicopter settled. The side door slid open, and a figure emerged, striding toward her fence line. As he got closer, lit by her porch light, she recognized the face. Older, lined with care and command, but unmistakably him. Jackson Matthews. He was a young captain the last time she'd seen him, a pilot with a cocky grin and eyes that had seen too much. Now he was a colonel. He stopped at the fence, not crossing onto her property without invitation. The gesture was one of profound, ingrained respect. "Ma'am," he said. His voice was rougher, deeper than she remembered. "It's been a long time." "It has, Jackson," she replied, her voice steady. She wiped her dirt-stained hands on her apron. "This isn't a social call." He shook his head, his expression grim. "No, ma'am, it's not. We have a mass cal incident up on the pass. Train derailment. Civilian command is overwhelmed. Triage is compromised. We're losing savable casualties." He paused and his eyes met hers. The next word he spoke changed everything. "We need Nightingale." It wasn't a question. It was a summons. Nightingale. A name she hadn't heard spoken aloud since the dust of a fallen city was still on her boots. It wasn't a nickname. It was a designation, a call sign. A stunned Dr. Carter, who had foolishly followed in an ambulance, arrived at the end of Evelyn's driveway just in time to hear this exchange. He saw the old nurse, the woman he'd patronized with cake and platitudes just hours before, and saw her entire being shift. The gentle stooped posture of the retired grandmother straightened. The weariness in her eyes was replaced by a sharp, focused light. Her jaw set. She was no longer Evelyn Reed, the sweet old nurse. She was someone else, someone harder, someone terrifyingly competent. "Get her kit," Colonel Matthews ordered into his radio. "The original." A young para-rescue man, a PJ with biceps as thick as tree limbs and a face that looked barely old enough to shave, jogged over from the helicopter. He was carrying a worn, olive-drab medical pack, its canvas faded and stained with the ghosts of old blood and desert sand. He held it with a reverence usually reserved for a holy relic. He offered it to Evelyn. She took it, her arthritic hands closing around the familiar straps. Her fingers moved with an unconscious muscle memory, checking the buckles, testing the weight. The transformation was complete. She looked at Colonel Matthews, and the voice that came out of her was not the soft, gentle one from the hospital. It was crisp, efficient, and resonant with command. "Casualty count, confirmed and estimated?" "At least 60 critical, maybe more," Matthews answered immediately, falling into the familiar rhythm of a battlefield report. "Primary injury patterns? High-velocity blunt force trauma, crush injuries, multiple amputations? Extraction window? We have 2 birds for immediate evac of Reds. A C-130 is being converted for walking wounded. ETA 60 minutes. She nodded, her mind processing the information with the speed of a supercomputer. She slung the pack over her shoulder. It looked like it belonged there. "Then let's go to work, Colonel." She strode toward the waiting Black Hawk, not even glancing at the dumbfounded Dr. Carter standing in her driveway. She climbed aboard with a practiced ease that defied her age, her small frame disappearing into the dark maw of the machine. The scene at the crash site was a Bosch painting of twisted metal, smoke, and human suffering. The ravine was a tangled mess of passenger cars, some bent in half, others ripped open to the rainy night sky. The screams of the injured echoed off the canyon walls. In the middle of it all, a casualty collection point had been established, but it was a disorganized mess of terrified victims and overwhelmed first responders. The moment Evelyn stepped off the helicopter, the entire dynamic of the scene shifted. She didn't shout. She didn't run. She simply walked into the heart of the chaos, her eyes scanning, assessing, categorizing. She pointed to a relatively flat, sheltered area beneath a rock outcropping. "This is our CCP," she announced to the nearest firefighter. "Red tags here," she pointed to the area closest to the waiting helicopter. "Yellows here, greens, get them up by the road and keep them warm. Blacks." She paused, her gaze sweeping over the bodies that were beyond help. "Move them to the far side. Give the living some peace." Her voice carried an authority that was absolute and unquestionable. Young, battle-hardened PJs and seasoned paramedics, men and women who would normally defer to no one, immediately began to follow her commands. She was the calm at the center of the storm. Dr. Carter, who had been flown up in the second bird, watched in total awe. He had been a doctor for a decade, but he had never seen medicine practiced like this. This wasn't healing. It was brutal, beautiful battlefield math. Evelyn moved from patient to patient, her hands sure and swift. Her triage took seconds. A glance at a wound, a finger on a pulse, a quick check of airway and breathing. A red tag here, a yellow tag there. And sometimes, with a look of profound sorrow but no hesitation, a black tag. She knelt beside a young woman pinned under a piece of metal, her legs clearly crushed. The woman was conscious, begging for help. Carter would have started 2 large-bore IVs, pumped her full of fluids and morphine, and spent the next hour trying to save her. Evelyn gently touched the woman's cheek, looked into her eyes, and saw the irreversible signs of internal bleeding and shock. She placed a black tag on her coat. "I'm so sorry," she whispered, a moment of pure humanity in the midst of inhuman calculation. Then she moved on to a man with a sucking chest wound, a salvable life, and in 90 seconds had a makeshift occlusive dressing applied, saving him from a collapsed lung. Carter was given the job of holding an IV bag for a patient with a simple fracture. He, the chief of emergency medicine, was reduced to the role of a first-year resident, and he had never felt more useless or more humbled. He watched as Evelyn performed a lateral canthotomy with a hemostat and a pair of trauma shears to save a man's eyesight from orbital compartment syndrome, a procedure so rare and delicate he'd only ever seen it on a simulator. She worked not from a textbook, but from a place of deep, terrible, and certain knowledge. Hours later, as the last of the critical patients was airlifted out, Colonel Matthews found Dr. Carter sitting on a rock, covered in mud and someone else's blood. The colonel handed him a canteen of water. "You look like you've seen a ghost, son." Carter shook his head, his voice hoarse. "Who is she? What is she?" Matthews looked over at Evelyn, who was now quietly cleaning her instruments with an alcohol wipe, her movements as precise and deliberate as they had been at the height of the chaos. "In the United States Air Force, we have pararescue men, PJs. Their job is to go into the worst places on Earth to save lives. But before them, there was a program, a proof of concept. A small experimental unit of surgical nurses and doctors embedded with special operations teams. They wrote the book on far-forward trauma care. They went on missions that were never declassified, into places that officially we were never in." He took a long drink from his own canteen. "She was the best of them, the absolute best. We called her the Nightingale, sometimes because she was a nurse, mostly because she was the one who showed up in the darkest night, right before the dawn. That woman," he said, his voice thick with a reverence that bordered on worship, "is Colonel Evelyn Reed, retired. She pioneered the triage protocols every medic in every branch of the service uses today. She wrote the book you studied in med school, son. She just never put her name on it." Back at the hospital, the sun was rising. The organized calm of a functioning trauma center had been restored, largely thanks to the steady stream of stabilized patients Evelyn had sent them. Evelyn herself was in a small, quiet supply room, meticulously repacking her ancient medical kit. Dr. Carter found her there. He stood in the doorway for a long moment, watching her. Finally, he spoke, his voice barely a whisper. "Colonel, I'm sorry. For today. For everything." Evelyn didn't look up from her work. She carefully placed a roll of gauze into a canvas pocket. "It's just Evelyn, Doctor," she said, her voice gentle again. "The battlefield commander gone, the nurse returned. And you did good work last night. You saved lives." She finally looked at him, and her eyes were kind, but they held the weight of all she had seen. "Your protocols are good. Your technology is a miracle. But they're tools. They don't replace this." She tapped her own chest right over her heart. "Or this." She held up her steady, knowing hands. "You have to learn to trust your gut as much as you trust your monitor." She secured the final buckle on her pack. "Now, hand me that saline flush from the crash cart, will you? We have another ambulance pulling in." Ben Carter, his world completely remade, simply nodded and did exactly as he was told.